Welcome to the Law Abiding Citizen podcast. My name is Thulani Mututa, the friendly neighborhood lawyer, the law orator, and your proud host. Today on the LAC podcast, we are joined by a master of human rights, Mr. Edward Madziwa, as we talk about the enforcement of your human rights in Zimbabwe. Welcome to the show, Eddie.
Thank you so much for having me today and inviting me to this very important show.
We're glad to have you, Eddie. And the reason why, as Mnangati and Associates, we are talking about the enforcement of your human rights in Zimbabwe is because we have received so many communications from the general public of people asking us to explain how exactly they can enforce their human rights. Eddie, as I was getting ready for this show, I had a really difficult time on thinking how to introduce you to our viewers and listeners because of your extensive experience in issues to do with human rights. May you please just explain to our viewers and listeners who is Edward Madziwa and how exactly he became a master of human rights.
Thank you so much. I also find it very difficult to introduce myself, but in short, I am a holder of a master of human rights, constitutional law and human rights from Indian State University.
Yes.
And I also hold a master in international humanitarian law and human rights from the Geneva Academy.
Okay, I also understand, Eddie, you are the recipient of a prestigious Henry Dunant Human Rights Award Prize. What exactly was that all about? And as I heard just from the social media, apparently it had been over nearly 20 years since anyone in Africa had received that prestigious Human Rights Award.
So the Henry Dunant Research Prize is a prize that is given to individuals who encapsulates the spirit of Henry Dunant, one of the co-founders of the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Okay.
And that's very true. I am the second person in Africa since the last one received it in 2011.
Okay.
So basically, it was for a research that I did at the Geneva Academy as part of my master's studies.
Okay. And now, Edward, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? I understand you're working with an international organization.
So currently, I am working with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, where I am conducting research on artificial intelligence policy and cybersecurity, looking at its intersection of these emerging technologies with international peace and security.
Okay, wonderful. Today we're going to be talking about the enforcement of human rights in Zimbabwe, Eddie. Maybe just before we begin talking about the enforcement, what are these human rights and how exactly are they entitled to people as per the Constitution of Zimbabwe?
So simply put, human rights are the entitlements that you have as an individual by virtue of you being human.
Okay, which means you do not have to do anything to acquire these human rights.
Exactly. You just have to be the person that you are. There are certain entitlements that come with that person you are. Yes.
And how exactly do these human rights apply in the day-to-day life of individuals? Are these human rights being respected? Are they being promoted in Zimbabwe? What exactly is the situation? And in terms of the Constitution, where can someone find these provisions on their human rights?
The first part of your question is a bit tricky because I have to go into issues of respect and stuff, but then I would just go on the issue of the sources of human rights. And the starting point at the national level is the Chapter 4 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, which deals with all those human entitlements that you have by virtue of you being human. And then there are also various regional and international treaties which provides for these entitlements as well.
Okay, and when it comes to the enforcement of these entitlements or of these rights, I understand that there is something that is called the Constitutional Court in Zimbabwe. If you have an infraction of your human rights, as you've put it, can you just rush to the Constitutional Court and have your rights enforced?
So for the purposes of enforcement, the Constitutional Court, in fact, the Constitution of Zimbabwe puts down 5 requirements for one to have legal standing or to have the opportunity or the requirement to approach the Constitutional Court for vindication of their rights.
Okay.
And in particular, Section 85 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe provides for the legal standing and what one should at least show for them to be able to approach the Constitutional Court for such
release that they want.
Yes.
So, is there a set criteria, or anyone with a substantial interest in a constitutional matter can just approach the Constitutional Court?
So, the first requirement is that you can act on your own person, like you are trying to vindicate your own individual rights that you feel you have been violated by probably the state or any other person.
Yes.
And the second requirement is you can act on behalf of another person. But then you have to show that that person is not in a position to act on his or her own behalf. And then thirdly, you might be a member of a group acting in the interests of the group that you represent. And another thing is you might even act in public interest. And there has been some cases on public interest issues within the Constitution.
Those are the issues I would like us to just briefly discuss, Eddie, for the benefit of our listeners, particularly relating to the issue of child marriages in Zimbabwe. I understand that the Constitution of Zimbabwe made a historical judgment wherein, by application, that judgment basically outlaws all forms of child marriages in Zimbabwe.
So in 2016, it is one of the first cases that the Constitutional Court of Zimbabwe had to deal with, and it addressed a very important matter which relates to child marriages.
Yes.
And basically, in some areas of Zimbabwe, we see that these child marriages, although the Constitutional Court outlawed them, they are still ongoing.
Yes, they still perpetuate.
Yes. But then that was a very important decision in that it then dealt with the issue of standing before the Constitutional Court, particularly in the interest of the public. And the outlawing of out marriages was a very significant step in the protection of the rights of women and girls in Zimbabwe.
Wonderful. So there you have it, viewers and listeners. You have human rights, and these human rights are enforceable, and they are enforced in terms of the Constitution of Zimbabwe and also by the decisions of the Constitutional Court. You are tuned into the Law Abiding Citizen podcast. We are talking about the enforcement of your human rights in Zimbabwe, and I am joined by a master of human rights, Mr. Edward Madziwa. So stay tuned as we take a short break and come back and discuss the topical issue of the abolition of the death penalty in Zimbabwe right after the break.
Hello everyone, my name is Edward Madziwa. I am an international law lawyer focusing on international humanitarian law and human rights. You are tuned into the Law Abiding Citizen podcast.
Welcome back to the Law Abiding Citizen podcast. It's now time to get into the second segment of our human rights show, where we're going to be talking about the abolition of the death penalty in Zimbabwe. Eddie, as I understand, there is a human right to life that is guaranteed and protected in terms of the Constitution. What is all this clamoring we're hearing about, which is essentially going to have an effect of abolishing the death penalty as punishment in Zimbabwe?
So as a starting point, the right to life is considered to be a primordial right upon which all other rights are founded. So we find that in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, we have Section 48, which provides for the right to life. But then Section 48.2 provides an exception to the right to life.
And by primordial, just to stop you right there, I see you're being an expert. But by primordial and by saying all other rights flow from the right to life, what exactly do you mean in terms that a layman can understand?
So when talking about a primordial right, we are talking about a right that is so very much important, or that is a paramount right, on which all other rights are informed. So for example, you cannot have the right to food, for example, without having the right to life. You cannot have the right to education without having the right to life. So this shows that these rights are interlinked, interdependent, and indivisible.
Wonderful, clear right there. So now in terms of the death penalty that was there before, and in terms of these exceptions, what exactly will it mean for the criminal justice system, wherein we are now saying that the judges of the high courts can no longer pass that death penalty as a sentence?
It is a step in the right direction.
Okay.
Firstly, because at the international level, there has been a movement towards the abolition of the death penalty.
Okay.
And Zimbabwe was one of the only few states that had remained, and for which had the power to issue
the death penalty. Okay, and also I understand that there was also an issue that came about as a challenge from having the death penalty being passed, but then having that penalty not being rendered. And then you find that someone may have been waiting for 10 years for them to be executed, yet they are still serving prison time. How exactly is that reconciled in terms of their human rights?
So there has been judgments at the regional and international level, whereby they have stated that by virtue of you having been given the death penalty and not it being acted on,
yes,
you risk being given or
yes,
subjected to torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment.
Yes, because you're waiting for the day to come where they execute that penalty, but then that day will not come.
Exactly, and you don't even know when the day will come,
yes,
because at the current moment, Zimbabwe doesn't have a hangman to
yes,
give effect
yes,
to the death penalty, and that is one of the biggest challenges. And at some point, there were some people who were on the death penalty dating back from as far as 2000.
Wow.
Somewhere there. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's really a challenge, especially when you are just there waiting to die, but you don't even know when you're going to die.
Well, we do welcome the initiative to actually abolish the death penalty, and we hope that that bill will be passed into law so that we comply, like you're saying, with the regional and international standards in terms of protecting human rights in Zimbabwe. Just before we round up the show, Eddie, as the expert, what exactly would you like to say as a parting shot to our loyal viewers and listeners who are tuned in right now?
The very first important thing is you have to know what you're talking about for you to be able to identify where there has been a violation or not.
Okay.
So I would encourage the loyal viewers to make sure that they do everything in their power to get to know the rights that are available to them and how they can enforce them.
Knowledge is power, as you have it from our expert today. Know your human rights. Know exactly how you can enforce your human rights, and it will also enable you to know how to protect against the infringement of your human rights. Once again, my name is Thulani Mututa, the friendly neighborhood lawyer, the law orator, and your proud host. Today, we're talking about your human rights in Zimbabwe with the legal expert that we had today, Mr. Edward Madziwa, who is experienced in human rights and has helped us understand how you can get relief when you need it, how exactly you can enforce your human rights in Zimbabwe. So until next time, stay law-abiding and stay legal-wise, and also tune in to more exciting legal initiatives that we have and that we're bringing you as Munangati and Associates and the Law Abiding Citizen Podcast.